welcome. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. This is a wonderful event. Second time we've managed to get Léopold here. Cruz is going to do the introduction to our speaker. But as you can already see in the room, there's a lot of people who know him for various reasons from around the world. Many are here, and you can just see all the greeting and all the kind of familiarity and respect and happiness that we've got him here with us again. I've asked him a few times, and he said yes this time. Anyway, this is the penultimate session of the fall public program, right? November 14th, we have our last event, and it's going to be held. We've just been deciding we're going to move it to the King Pavilion because the space they gave us in the university is across campus, and we're afraid in the winter you guys won't walk across campus because it's just too cold. So we're going to do it in the King Pavilion. Please watch for information about that. But just we're almost there, almost through the semester's public programs. Really happy you're here. Really happy you were here, Léopold. And Cruz, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. And as Deborah mentioned, we are the penultimate lectures of the lecture series that deals with modernity. And why Léopold is here, I think, has a lot to do with that question of what modernity is. How do we question modernity? How do we use the tools we have as architects to engage with the many questions, problematics, challenges, complications, urgencies. Just to give a bit of background, reading briefly Léopold's bio, he's a trained architect living in Paris. He's the editor-in-chief of the Funambulist Magazine. And this is a really incredible source for those of you that are not familiar. I'm sure Léopold is going to talk about it, but it's a really incredible source, not only for text, but also audio pieces, to discover people. Sometimes we're wondering, like, I wish I knew architects and thinkers from the non-usual places, right? I think the Funambulist may be one of the best sources of that around the world. He's the author of 4 books, interpreting architecture as a discipline that organizes bodies in space, in particular in settler colonial contexts, such as Palestine, Kanaki, and Algeria. Weaponized architecture, the impossibility of innocence, Topi in Topia, the corporeal, I'm sure I butchered that, but I'm sorry. Natalie's the French one, not me. The corporeal politics of the cloth, the wall, and the street. The politics of bulldozer, the Palestinian ruin as an Israeli project. And states of emergency, a spatial history of the French colonial continuum. Also, as a side note, Léopold is somebody that has been, we've been in contact with each other for many, many years. I think as soon as we were out of school, almost in the early before 2010, right? And it was really interesting to see how questions were shaped by the same forces of a really brutal awakening of the relationship of architecture and capitalism and settler colonialism, right? Like, we both are from the generation of 2008. That is maybe the closest thing to 2020, but I think in a smaller scale, of the financial crisis, of wondering what's the relationship of architecture in all of this, why architecture behaves in the way it does as a profession, as an industry. Also, Léopold has been really fundamental in many of the things that we've been doing, including our Blog Readers platform. We also had the opportunity to collaborate in his magazine to write maybe the most important work we ever done. That is the letter to our daughter. That is when she was born, we were contributing to his issue on land from settler colonial property to land back. And it was a really special moment in our life because our baby was just born, but also it took us a long time to think about her name and how it related to many of the things that we feel are important in what we do as teachers, as architects, as professors, right? As part of a bigger community. And Léopold has always been somebody that creates networks of really interesting, kind, generous people around him, right? So every time that we have a question, like, do you know somebody working in the east of Africa focusing on networks of solidarity in such a way, say like, yes, I have a list of 5 people that are going to be great for you. You know, Palestinian people that are working with alternative platforms, yeah, you know, you should write to Radio Al-Hara, you know, because they're amazing architects, but also they have all these other platforms, right? So it's a completely resourceful I would say, platform in a way, extremely generous, and I think it's really important also for the students to understand what are the many ways in which architects can exercise their responsibility, their power, their agency. I don't like that word too much, but you know what I mean, like whatever responsibility or power you have, you can shape that, right? And I think Léopold is a perfect example of how do you use the devices, the tools, the interest, the curiosity, the questions you have, right? Resources you have, and put them into something that you find has some use for other people, right? And so, without further introduction, here with us, Léopold Lambert.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I know that since COVID, the lectures have had a little bit less audience, so I'm very grateful to see many people here. I'm extremely grateful for this introduction by Cruz, and it particularly resonates with me because I think, you know, it's always important to know what you're trying to do when you're doing something, and one of the key sort of notions that I'm trying to do is to be useful. So I think in what Cruz was just mentioning, it feels like I'm doing at least not too bad of a job on that part, so that's good. I'm extremely thankful to Deborah Hauptmann for her absolutely unique. And this is, I'm French, I don't use superlatives like you guys do. Like when I use it, like it means it actually is what it is. So this absolutely unique sense of hospitality, you know, I mean, what Cruz kind of sort of hinted at when talking about Natalie, him, and myself being part of the same generation is the fact that we had to talk about exactly these kind of topics of today. To walls quite often back in the days, and many things have changed that in ways that are really remarkable. But negotiating this kind of topic with the institution is usually something a little bit challenging. Although I don't want to make us look like pariahs or martyrs or in any way. I think that would be a bit ridiculous, but to actually have someone who represents an institution, someone who has power in those institutions to actually be that welcoming to me is really beyond the human dimension of it is truly remarkable. So I want to acknowledge that. So today I'm gonna create. And sorry, I'm just thinking like, what did I forget to say? And indeed, what I forgot to say is that how happy I am to see some people that I know already in this audience. So it's very nice to be able to have some already friendly faces and then some people I met this morning, which is great too. So today, yeah, the talk is about one very non-modernist, I suppose. A tool that we see absolutely everywhere in our life, which is a key. But perhaps to describe a little bit more the sort of context in which I think about those things. Indeed, like it's difficult not to talk about what is, to begin with, my main job, which is very much this magazine. So the today's talk is much more like sort of my author. There's really no word to really define that without feeling like a complete imposter. So I don't know if author, writer, researcher, which one is the least sort of the least odd to use. But my main cap is really to be the editor of this magazine I created in 2015. And you know, last time I was here, I think we were around that one, so issue 16. And just today we inaugurated issue 44. So it's been quite a journey. Like it's a magazine that started in 2015. Every 2 months you have like one issue on a particular topic that usually tries to that really responds to two goals, really. One is to approach political struggles around the world through space, which is something that as architects we sort of have for ourselves. Like we don't have much for ourselves, but we have that. And it's almost as if we had some sort of glasses we were able to wear and then sort of read the world through space. So it's really not a better or a worse approach to anything, to any aspect of our reality, but it's a very deliberate and precise approach. So to be able to bring it to political struggle is something that could potentially prove useful for them, which is what we try to do. And then the other usefulness we try to reach is to cultivate internationalist solidarities between those political struggles. To give you a little bit of an idea of what it looks like inside, especially since since our number 40th issue, where it's no longer me doing the pretty clumsy graphic design, but we have like a very talented graphic designer, Walid Bouchouchi, who does it for us, and this is how we got to publish Cruz and Natalie's absolutely gorgeous text, gorgeous letter to their daughter, little Emma. Where is she? I lost you, Natalie. Huh? In the back, yeah. And then 5 issues since 5 issues since then. We just started the pre-orders of our new issue on deserts just today. And so as I said, like one of the things we're able to do as architects is indeed to not only perceive reality through space, but it's also the ability to represent it, for example, through cartography, as I try to often do in the magazine. Sometimes it's very geographical cartography, sometimes it's a little bit less literal, like this map of the biggest diasporas in the world in relationship to which country in which they are. And then, when I said cultivate internationalist solidarity, I didn't mean it in a very reductive way, where perhaps, being located in Paris and being always a little bit in contact with North America, having lived here for a while myself, it would have been easy to deal with political struggles in those kind of areas, and then a few others in the global south. But we could not look at ourselves in the mirror if we were claiming such an internationalist solidarities without actually being fully worldly, including entire geographical areas that sometimes in the kind of space that we are ourselves, because of course in other spaces they're in no way invisibilized, but in our space are a little bit invisibilized, like the anti-colonial struggles in Oceania, for example, but also in many other places. So those are all the geographies that were mobilized in the 44 issues of the magazine. And to perhaps now approach a little bit this other cap of mine that are quite literal caps. I'm going to use writers this time. As a writer, indeed, this led to a few books that always revolved around the same question, which is the political weaponization of architecture. And as you can see on the subtitle of that first book I wrote 12 years ago, which makes it very difficult to reread it today without feeling like it was what I was writing back then was very silly, was the impossibility of innocence, and as architects, the absolute impossibility of claiming political innocence when we engage with that discipline. Yeah, so those are all the books. This one is the most recent and really like a much like a 5 years sort of culmination of work around the French colonial continuum, in particular, as Cruz was mentioning, in three particular geographies and space-time in general, which are the Algerian Revolution in the 50s and 60s, the indigenous insurrection in Kanaki, like New Caledonia, in the 80s, and the massive anti-racist uprising in French peripheral neighborhoods, the banlieue, in the 2000s. And that, yeah, which are those, which led also to other ways of trying to engage with modes of representation in cartography and trying to represent space-time, which is something that Cruz and Natalie have been doing absolutely beautifully with their map of complicity of architecture with regimes of anti-blackness. I hope you all saw that really beautiful space-time map. And when I say beautiful, I obviously don't mean it. I mean, I don't just mean the aesthetical dimension of it, but the power they communicate in bringing regimes of anti-blackness that are working hand in hand, really, like South African apartheid, anti-blackness in North America, and Australian settler colonialism. So yeah, representing space-time is not an easy thing, and that's something that I'm interested in doing, not for the sake of like being able to represent, but in the way it manages to create bridges between different histories, different struggles, and different spaces. Jumping much more in the core of what I wanted to present today, I'm going to try to talk about this little object that probably all of us have in our pockets right now, if not in our pockets, in our bag or whatever, which is a key, and trying to show how the key is one essential object to very much allow for architecture to enforce three distinct regimes of exclusion and oppression. In order to do that, I first need to give you a little bit more of an indication of the way I interpret architecture. I came up with one definition of architecture about 12 years ago and kept it words per words ever since, which perhaps says more about my stubbornness than anything else. But I define architecture as a discipline that organizes bodies in space. So, you know, architects trace lines, and then political regimes are created on each of those lines, and bodies have to navigate within those assemblage of lines. And in order to enforce this spatial organization, they came up with an invention we all know very well, which is called the wall. And the wall, I don't know if you noticed, for 99.9% of cases are built in such a way that our own bodies, however strong or weak we are not really able, with their sheer energy, to affect drastically. Said in a more simplistic way, if I try to run into that wall behind me, then I'm going to hurt myself pretty badly. And I would have probably not really damaged the wall. Perhaps some of us might manage, but I think no one will really manage to go through. And so of course, once you have this invention that very much controls bodies in space, because if I cannot go through that wall, then I'm not even going to try. I'm going to try to find other ways to be in that space, and perhaps to be in the middle of it instead. And then you have several different spatial assemblages that involve walls, where the organization of bodies in space is even stronger, And this is how I came to study quite a few years ago now, the political power of the corridor. Corridors being, of course, sort of, I mean, in the sort of the most typological manner, two walls that are parallel to each other, and that forces bodies to go from point A to point B, and from point B to point A, but also sometimes only from point A to point B, like this, of course, very extreme example, yet I think very expressive one of Dr. Temple Grandin's pass for cattle to go to its death in slaughterhouse without really understanding what's happening and without stressing them, which really asks questions about animal rights ethics, but like this is really not the topic in that case. But the topic here is much more about how with just architecture, and in that case just like 1.50 meters maybe tall walls, you can have bodies, you can force bodies to go from point A to point B, and in that case to their deaths, which is far from innocent, of course. As much as it constitutes a gross comparison to jump from here to the Israeli apartheid checkpoints in Palestine, I think it would be silly not to see how it is exactly the same materiality that allows for the same political intention, which is to move bodies from one point to another in those way too exiguous corridors that the Israeli apartheid is building to very much control and discipline Palestinian bodies on a daily basis, because those are checkpoints that Palestinian workers with a permit have to go through every morning and every evening. And then, so once we sort of understand the way walls operate and the way walls discipline bodies, we need to talk about another invention that makes the walls somehow, I mean, that just because we can only notice how the environment that surrounds us is not just made of corridors. It's not the only program that is the only political intention that is applied to architecture is not just movement. It's not just bringing bodies from one point to another, but we talking about another invention, which is a door. We see how the door is a sort of wall on which one may be able to act upon, and in doing so, being able to sort of modulate a little bit the effect of the wall. So a wall is a wall, so you cannot cross it. So we're gonna need another invention somehow for bodies to go inside the space, for example, quite simply. But what that creates is that it creates a vulnerability in the spatial scheme that was created. Like I said, like architecture is the discipline that organizes bodies in space. So you have walls to do that, and if you start creating doors, it's almost as if you create something against the very scheme you just started. And so it constitutes a point of vulnerability that needs to be acted on. And this is how we invent a third invention, which is the lock and the key that goes with the door and that goes with the wall. And the key is this really very, very small object, but that somehow makes it all work together, insofar that you can distribute the key only to the people that are deemed to take advantage and to benefit from what an architecture has to offer, perhaps, whereas others would remain excluded from it. So, yeah, in this very, very little object, this is literally a patent from 1928 presenting a lock and a key. And the most obvious political regime that is created by the key is one we all know very well, which is private property. So this is the door of my office, for example, with the keys on it, if you might see them. And this is basically what allows for us to live in a space where everyone but ourselves have access to put it in a very simplistic way. And as a sort of social contract, we also know that we have access to no space except the one that was based on different criteria, social class being the most obvious one. We get access to, or we were given the keys of, quite literally. And of course, we, as I said, like perhaps we're all okay with private property. I don't know. That's perhaps another conversations to have. I personally am not, but that's not really the topic here. At a sort of simplistic level, we sort of in our life, hoping that all of us over here have a home of sorts. We sort of are okay with the idea that we cannot go inside any other space than our own, because we have our own, and no one else is allowed to go in our own except ourselves. So somehow we sort of, most of us, even though we don't necessarily realize we're getting screwed by that system, we sort of are on a day-to-day basis relatively okay with it. But of course, there are people in society who have no keys whatsoever and who are subjected to absolute exclusion from that system, and it's people that, for lack of a better word, we might call homeless, to whom it is very obvious that the key is an absolute object of power that triggers an absolute exclusion of their own person. Not only that, but also the state itself sort of keeps the rights of going back on this sort of social contract, and at times might be denying the sort of what in the U.S. you might want to call the sanctity of private property, which is also problematic. But well, that's again, like, there's many things that could be that could create many other discussions. And I find those photos absolutely striking of Muslim homes being raided by the French police at the beginning of the 2015 state of emergency in France. And I find them striking, of course, for the realities they are showing, but also for their architecturalness. It's like, I feel that very often in school we learn that, or even after school, like working in an architecture office, there's something called architecture, and this is never going to be sort of integrated in the realms of what architecture is about. When clearly when the Islamophobic police raids on Muslim homes are happening, there is an architectural transformation that is happening. So I think this is something we need to be very aware of as well. There is a context in which private property impose an additional layer of violence, and a very, very strong one, which is the settler colonial context, for example, where we are at the moment in this settler colony of the United States of America. What does that mean to build architecture? What does that mean to build walls? What does that mean to even have those little threads, metallic threads with little spikes on it, like the most elementary invention of settler colonialism, this barbed wire. Someone called Olivier Razak wrote a book that has been translated in English called A Short Political History of Barbed Wire, which is really excellent to show that. What does that mean to have those different architectural elements built on stolen land, stolen indigenous land, and how does architecture with this set of walls, doors, keys implement the indigenous dispossession of a place like this place, which I have huge trouble with this map because it's showing the U.S. With the current borders, when the settler colonial borders kept changing, of course. but I still find it interesting insofar of in the ways that it shows the different steps of indigenous dispossession that were all crystallized by the construction of architecture and infrastructure. And interestingly enough, I didn't know that until yesterday. I'm reading a great book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz today, those days. And Iowa happened to be part of what is called the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, whereby the United States bought probably what is about 20% of its current territory from France, and so French people have it easy to criticize Americans as if the Americans they had in mind, as in white Americans, were not part of themselves and not Western Europeans themselves, but quite literally, the dispossession of indigenous land in the Midwest has been done by the French themselves. So we tend to think Louisiana, what French used to call Louisiana, as a French occupied territory in what is now known as the United States, as being the state of Louisiana, but not at all. Louisiana is what was called Louisiana is basically almost entirely the Midwest, Iowa included. And then there's a third political regime that the key implements, and that is also very obvious when you think about it, which is carceralism. So anything that has to do with locking people into cages, be it prisons, be it detention centers, be it psychiatric hospital, jails, anything that put people into cages. And of course, that's easy to understand because as much as private property was the extreme exclusion of all bodies except those who have this little magic object of the key, carceralism is a sort of the reverse movement in which it's the extreme inclusion of bodies into a space while depriving them from the little object, the little magic object of the key that would allow them to live from it. But I think something that's important to realize is that if someone, even inadvertently, would lock us into this room that we take for granted as being able to come and go without any problem, all of a sudden would become a carceral space, much likely for only a few minutes or a few hours, so it probably would not be too bad, but all of a sudden the architecture around us seems to us very differently because we would be deprived from the little objects that allows us to leave that room when we need to. Importantly, when it comes to talking to architects in relationships to carceralism, I feel obligated to say that the gesture of architecture, the architectural gesture of caging people is the same whether we are dealing with the worst possible carceral condition. Here it's an incredible film, I don't know if you've seen it, Hunger, by Steve McQueen, about Irish political prisoners' resistance in British colonial prisons in the north of Ireland. So some of the worst possible carceral example you can think of, although you can pretty much take any prison in this country and show something pretty horrifying about it. So from this side of the spectrum all the way to what architects are trying to sell us today as being an acceptable form of encaging people, such as this architecture office you probably don't really know, hopefully, but that is relatively famous in Western Europe, calling this place in peripheral Paris as a minimum security prison. So a minimum caging of people. You can think of the violence of this sort of euphemism. So I think it's very important for me to convey the point that there is no better prison. There is no semi-caging people. There is just this action of providing the spatial and material conditions for bodies to be deprived from the only little objects that would allow them to have control on their environment and live it if they need to. So this is already, I don't know how long I've been, perhaps perhaps too long, I don't know. But I have one little conclusion that's a little bit more, I don't know if optimistic is the right word, but it's true that, I'm of course used to talk about a lot of regime of violence that resonates with us in a different way, depending on who we are and how much on which side of the violence we've experienced those regimes. But I want to leave you with something a little bit more, examples of resistance within the regimes I just described. And I particularly love how here I'm able to mobilize a small, very common, very mundane other little object, which is a spoon. And for years I've been talking about the spoon and thinking of it more in a Hollywoodian context, where you would see like prisoners escaping a prison with a little spoon. But actually, just last year, 6 Palestinian political prisoners managed to escape from an Israeli military prison just by digging a tunnel with a spoon. So now I don't even need to mobilize U.S. hegemonic cultural production, and I can just talk about Palestine to talk about it, which is great. And this is very interesting, not just for the sort of romanticization that it allows us, and to have like this. All of a sudden, the spoon as a political object, as a political symbol, but also because it allows us to think about architecture's violence in another scale of time, which is very interesting. Because as I say, if I try to run into that wall, I'm going to hurt myself. I can try to do it. I can try to do it every day. I probably would really end up with a huge medical bill given the healthcare of this country, but if somehow I changed completely the way I think about time and effort and the effect I might have on architecture as a body, and start to scratch it with a spoon like that. And prison itself bringing people into a complete different scale of time, of course, because people are there for years without much to do, or they're there for years under duress. So in a sudden, you might be able to start scratching and affecting the wall all the way to perhaps creating a hole in the wall, which I find very powerful as a sort of counter logic to the ones I've been describing so far. Similarly, the key itself, as the very first image of that presentation tried to suggest, and some of you already know that, some might not, but the key is already a very strong political symbol in the sort of Palestinian resistive cosmology, insofar that when 800,000 Palestinians were expelled from their land in 1948 when the Zionist paramilitary groups, and then followed by the Israeli army when the State of Israel was created, evicted those families from their home all the way to other parts of Palestine or to Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. People kept the keys of their house, originally just because they thought they would be able to come back in a relatively short amount of time, only to realize that 70 years later they are not able to. And of course those keys today opens literally nothing, because not only their house were destroyed in 1948, the ruins of their house were later destroyed as a denial of their very presence in Palestine prior to the creation of the State of Israel. So that's what I try to describe in this third little book, the Bulldozer Politics. And so those keys open nothing, but somehow they became the symbol of what we call the return, the ability for Palestinian refugees to return on their land. And so in several Palestinian refugee camps, such as this one in Aida, in Bethlehem, so, I mean, assuming as good Midwestern, many of you are Christians, it's really just I don't know, 1 mile away from the Church of Nativity where Jesus was born. That key, that massive key with also, as you can see, the gate itself, which is like in the shape of a keyhole, is the entrance of the refugee camp, and you can see the Israeli apartheid wall behind. But so the key is really a true marker, a true symbol for a futurist Palestinian manifesto of return, so it's absolutely crucial. And then the very last thing I wanted to leave you with is this time no longer in Palestine, but in Algeria, in Algiers specifically, where in the Kasbah, like the old city of Algiers, which the French destroyed half of it when they first invaded Algeria in 1830. In 1957, at the core of the Algerian Revolution for liberation against French colonial rule, there was a sort of battle, a very asymmetrical battle between the forces of the Algerian National Liberation Front and the French colonial army. And, you know, a very asymmetric one, like the fighters of the FLN, the National Liberation Front, were, of course, completely outnumbered, out-equipped, and all this against like what was back then the third biggest army in the world. But yet, because the Kasbah is this space that French never fully comprehended, because only saw it through either Orientalist vision or a militaristic vision as something that they were not able to control, because somehow too sinuous, somehow too dense, somehow too allowing too much escape from the roof, and with no vehicles being able to penetrate, all these kind of things, the French never fully managed to control it. It gave a chance to the FLN to actually fight this asymmetrical battle in the Kasbah. And then one particular aspect of it, which everything I just said, I know it for years and years now, but one thing I didn't know until recently, and that a friend of mine, Mathieu Rigoust, taught me in a book of his, is that one other thing that Algérois, so the inhabitants of Algiers specifically, did in the Kasbah that really allowed for the FLN to be able to fight the French army was that no one locked their doors. And that allows them to escape more easily. Like you could literally take any door, and so all of a sudden you have an entire part of the city that is working for you as a revolutionary rather than working for the colonial army like the rest of the city probably would. And so I really like this story, and I kind of like this photo I took because the fountain looks like it's also in a keyhole. So I think it's kind of bring it all back home. Sorry. So yeah, thank you. I just realized that it's filmed and all my bad jokes are now forever on film.
Yeah, it would be good to get some questions.
From an architectural point of view, how would you maybe summarize, because I know it's like a huge topic, the way that we change the space and time around us?
Okay, you know, I was going to say, well, in the ways that I try to explain here, so I was afraid of repeating some aspect of it, but actually I have one more example I could add to it that perhaps would hopefully bring it home. Which is an example I used very often back in the days because, you know, like 12 years ago, I would talk about architecture's violence, all that, and I would talk a lot about Palestine, and people would tell me, well, yeah, but okay, you use Palestine as the example to describe our reality for us who don't live in Palestine. So it seems a bit cheating on your argument because you're using the extreme to try to explain the mundane. What about the little shelter that protects us from the rain and this kind of thing. Like people always had like this sort of like very romantic, if not romanticized, image of the primitive architecture that is just here to shelter us, which I think is already probably a historical myth. But still, like I think I was interested in saying like, okay, yeah, what about it? What about the little shelter? And perhaps not thinking like for us not to be all romantic and go in the mountains with like the little shelter or something, just taking a stupid bus stop. Again, like I can make a joke about US and public transportation perhaps, but just a bus stop, just a roof, so literally no walls. So I don't even have the one thing that I started my argument with, just one roof. And imagine like just a torrential rain falling on the city, and then everybody trying to seek shelter from the rain and sort of trying to seek shelter under that roof of the bus stop. There will come, of course, inexorably a moment where there will no longer be any space for any additional body to seek shelter. And you know, it's a pretty, if we accept that, you know, there's no one with a child, there's no one with like health issues, like everybody's sort of the same, so to speak. If we sort of assume everybody is sort of the same, it doesn't seem like a very politically outrageous situation that some people no longer are able to benefit from architecture's protection just because, you know, there's already a good bunch of people there. So meaning like this is not a political critique here, it's just a political analysis of what we are looking at. And what we're looking at, once there's no longer any space for bodies to be able to seek shelter, is that architecture has de facto created two political conditions, a political condition of the included and a political condition of the excluded. And again, this is not yet about critiquing any of those political conditions, but of course, you know, the world is not a bus stop in which we can all benefit. I mean, you know, we can talk about collectivism maybe, but most contexts we are familiar with, and definitely this one, the sort of protocols through which someone is deemed included or someone is deemed excluded is usually not under the same sort of modalities and a little bus stop in the city or something like that, and it's usually through private property and other regimes of exclusion that depends on highly political things such as social class and many others. But even the most mundane, the most almost apolitical architecture somehow creates two political conditions of included and excluded. And I think that's what every time we as architects trace a line on a paper that would potentially become a space we have to have in mind.
So you talk about like there being like architecture inherently will create an exclusionary space and an included space, but the fact that that is inherent, like do you have any thoughts on like how an architect should go about like figuring out like how do I include the most amount of people, or like at what point do I draw the line of like I have to exclude some people because this is a space? Like how do I create how do I choose who gets keys or not? Yeah. And like how to create a system that is, well, I dislike the phrasing, it's the only phrase I can think of. Like how do we create a system that is fair?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the question, and I actually really love the way you asked it, because usually, but I think it's also times that are changing, because I feel the questions that usually come is, yeah, but don't you think there isn't like any architecture, like there's no possibility for architecture or non-violence or something like that, or non-violent, non-discriminatory architecture? And I think the way you frame the question is exactly the same way I would want to frame it, which is that who am I? I mean, of course the I is like this very single architect figure, which, you know, I think we should also try to part from and much more say we than I in the process of designing architecture. But who am I excluding and who am I including is the key question about, are those who I am excluded the same that are excluded in the sort of normative political regimes I live in? Like who are always being marginalized within those political regimes, and is the architecture I create reinforcing that or challenging that? And if we don't think about it, of course architecture is going to reinforce it. There's no way. I mean, there's like one chance in a billion that you end up with something that is not reinforcing the dominant order if you don't think about it. And so, you know, if you somehow design, I don't know, like a queer community space, or a space of organizing, of anti-racist organizing of any sort, you're going to have to find also, as an architect, to find ways to make it defendable against potential fascist or white supremacist attacks or something like that. So you're excluding them, you're trying to protect away from them. So there is a violence in that. There is something that is, you know, that sort of understand political antagonism that happens because, you know, the fascists are there. Like we're not gonna convince them just by being nice to them or something like that. So I think the same goes with architecture. And this is what I usually call an ethics of violence, which I know sounds a little bit scary when you hear it like that, but I really truly believe in that. I think it is precisely when we're able to conceptualize what kind of violence is legitimate and what kind is not for ourselves, that we're able to be a little bit able to have agency on it specifically. And perhaps just to, I mean, because I feel when I start speaking about an ethics of violence, I sort of want to be as clear as possible. I might hopefully not bore you with an example, just to make sure that you understand what I mean. On July 12th, 2019, well, I can make it autobiographical if it makes it even more narrative friendly, but I received a text message from my office saying, we need help, we are occupying the Pantheon. So like, if anyone has been to Paris, you might see like this big former church that's been turned into a mausoleum for, literally it's written on it, the great men of the nation. Only very few women are there. We're occupying the Pantheon. There are 600 of us. Please, we need support. And I know it came from like an organization of undocumented activists who are doing like big actions like that. So I go there. I realize, I realize they're still inside. The police are surrounding the Pantheon. And then after a while, the 600 people, most of whom are East African or West African, so black people mostly, comes out of the church. We learned that there was a negotiation with the police that they, and by the way, inside it was crazy. It was absolutely gorgeous. You take like the most nationalistic institutional building with like all of its representation, all its symbology and everything, and you have 600 West and East African men mostly, because they're undocumented workers, and it's gender-wise, it's really overwhelmingly men. So 600 black men in this sort of temple of French nationalism. Like it's absolutely, the images were absolutely striking in how powerful and beautiful they were. But so the police sort of tricked them into coming out, sorry, it's a very long story, but tricked them into coming out from the building and without being arrested. And of course, as soon as they were out of the building, they were surrounded by the police. And so us, like who have came later, were on the other side of the police and only being able to, so like there's two rows of police looking on both sides, And we are free to go if we want, and those inside are not free. And 4 times that afternoon, the police charged people and start beating them up, but in a way that would leave no escape whatsoever. And it was, I mean, I've seen some bad shit in my life, but that was really, really horrifying. And what appeared to me that day is that there was going to be violence. Like, violence was inevitable. And then the only sort of negotiation with violence was whether it was going to be that cruel violence. I mean, I took care of someone who fell into the coma that day. I mean, it's absolutely horrifying. Or there could have been our violence. Not mine. I'm not very good at that. But like, you know, we have some good Antifa in Paris that could have been called. And they would have, you know, I'm not calling for cops to be particularly, I mean, yeah, publicly I'm not calling for cops to be beaten up in a particularly severe way, but there could have been a way to engage physically with the police that would have allowed for people to escape. And that's what I call an ethics of violence. Like, there could have been a physical engagement with it for a much greater, much more cruel violence to happen. And so I think this, even though that's almost not an architectural example, it kind of is, because when you know how the streets works and everything, it was very easy to surround people. It would have been more difficult in another place. But it's not really an architectural example, but I think we can apply the same thing exactly in the way you frame the question, in trying to be serving the political ideals we want to serve rather than reinforcing the dominant order.
Yeah, thanks very much, Léopold, for that talk. And it's, you know, I really appreciate these kind of issues being put on the agenda and your part in this work. I agree that architecture is not innocent, but my question really is kind of how guilty is it, right? Because my concern in what you're saying, and I think it's borne out by some of the responses you've had, is that we're imputing political power to architecture on its own, that it doesn't have. Because, you know, the answer to the question, well, what can architecture do that's the opposite of that is, well, not much, because architecture is not autonomous. Architecture depends on the political interests, it depends on business interests. So, you know, with the exception of people who, you know, build prisons, and they just should not sleep at night, I think if we get to that more kind of essential notion of, well, architecture is about building walls and directing people, that can be, you know, a lot of the politics of that is also in the use. So there's like the intended use, and then there's also, you know, many cases of unintended uses which actually are, you know, entirely against the purpose of them. So I was thinking of, examples I expect you'll know of, I'm sure you'll know of, but like in the Paris Commune, 1871, the communards, so the people resisting, trying to overthrow the dominant powers, were using, as I understand, like the upper stories of, you know, so to escape the police, we're using the garrets of the buildings, because they could get through from one, you know, go in one door and come out another. But then the Israeli Defense Force used similar tactics to get at the Palestinians as well. An example I was reading about this morning was in the 17th century in England, when there's this massive wave of incarceration. And what they're doing is incarcerating basically anyone who's not the nobility, or the bourgeoisie, so especially Irish, gypsies, anyone who's begging, pirates, and gathering them all together in prisons. And there's this massive wave of uprisings, and the prisons are the epicenters of that because they put everyone together who could all plot together to overthrow it.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a nice crowd.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and they got together and talked. Yeah, so so to come back to those are just some examples of how there's intended use and unintended use.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so that's my concern is like, are we not kind of attributing too much political power directly to architects at the risk of understanding that they're typically working as accessories to larger apparatuses?
So that's funny because you started your question saying too much power on architecture, and now you finished the question with too much power on architects. And I think that's a distinction I really want to make because same thing in the Algerian Revolution. They put all the Algerians fighters, and people assumed to be fighters, and soon, very often we were not in the same spaces. So even the people who were not really fighting ended up escaping and fighting. But the architects of the prison are responsible only for the caging of people, not for what could potentially be a sort of like of people subduing those effects. And so, but it's true that I agree with you to a certain degree on architecture itself. And when I was talking about the Casbah, it's of course architecture, and Orange Sudden, it's architecture that can be that can serve the revolutionaries in ways that are extremely interesting, I think. But if an architect was trying to design the Casbah for revolutionaries, they would fail miserably because architects can only rationalize a space, and they intend, and sometimes they intend it for the best, with the best possible intention, and perhaps sometimes it's a good thing. I guess it's a good thing my daughter cannot cross walls at daycare and roam around the city with that. Like meaning it's not because I'm saying that the wall organizes bodies in space that necessarily it's always going to be something we need to fight against. However, something that's absolutely crucial for me to say, because you talked about architecture as being autonomous, is that there are no space that exists in which you enter and you become free. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. There are spaces in which you enter and you are no longer free, and we call them prisons. And this, as much as I advocated a little bit of violence against cops, like I don't wish prison on my worst enemy. This is something very important. I mean, we had I don't know how many of you know much about French politics, but we have one of our most horrifying presidents, Nicolas Sarkozy, who has like about 6 good reasons to go to prison now. And I don't even wish that on him. That's a very good abolitionist test of me, whether I wish or not. And I don't, so I must be a good abolitionist, I suppose. But yeah, I think it's very, very, very crucial to understand that, yes, there are many ways to approach architecture that are not as sort of bleak, let's say, as I do. But it's always easier for architecture to enforce control than to somehow provide conditions of resistance. It's much easier to say, oh my God, we saw too many homeless people on campus of Iowa State University, we're going to create a giant wall around it. Like, how simple of an architectural gesture is that, creating a wall around a place? But to start saying, okay, we're going to try to create a space where people who are homeless could come seek shelter, perhaps have a bed there, but also should not feel like it's a space that is sort of condescendingly given to them, in which they feel like they have a little bit of possibility of agency. God, I'm sorry, Cruz. Like to think of an architecture that would somehow provide the right conditions for such a political program is so much more complicated than just doing a wall around. So I think that is where architecture is not neutral. Everybody understands that. Everybody understands all architecture is political. no architecture is neutral, but also all architecture has a tendency to want to implement regimes of control, whereas so somehow to go against that needs to be almost fighting with architecture against architecture. So it's a very complicated thing to do. But I think that's a good thing to be at school, because that's when you have time to perhaps think about what that might look like. So on that, I wish you luck, I guess.
I feel like the TV host.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, right?
So thank you so much, Leopold. It was really great discussion. I had a question about, so you brought up the architectural gesture of imprisonment is the same across the board, no matter what you're trying to do. And I guess I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on like the new age prisons, the kind of the rehabilitative, what are they, like camps or something that are happening in Scandinavian countries? And I just wanted to know like what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, it's bad. No, but I mean, abolitionists such as Russi Wilson-Gilmore or Mariam Kaba talks about that in ways that I will never reach the brilliance of. But very simply, if you integrate rehabilitation, if you invest energy, money, space in a rehabilitation program in a prison, you're able to invest that same means before people get to a point where they would be in a situation where they would be arrested and put in prison. So that's as simple as that. That's all abolitionism is arguing for, is to be able to provide conditions in which what we very easily and very privilegedly for many of us call crime in a very indistinctive way, and without considering any sort of the social context in which this is happening, that whatever is defined as crime has no reason to happen in a context where help is provided and society cares for its members, essentially. So yeah, no prisons like that. The only thing about the only good thing about, no, it's not even a good thing, but the only thing that's maybe worth noticing in the Scandinavian penal system is that there is no life sentences, but you know, it's, yeah, we have to part radically from this all.
One more question to wrap up, if somebody has one.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for this. During your talk, I couldn't help. I couldn't stop thinking about, you know, especially I live in Des Moines and like urban spaces there, and even the kind of more mundane zones of exclusion that happen there, and especially that architectures of exclusion are also taking on the appearance of transparency and accessibility. For instance, like a skyscraper that sets back, creates a plaza, but that plaza is actually not, you know, public. Yeah, it's actually policed privately, etc. And you're not welcome there. But it takes on the appearance of being welcoming or what have you. So as a metaphor of like this opaqueness, I don't know. Is there? Do you see or how do you follow that thread of the illusion of access or transparency?
I mean, I agree with you that it is something worth looking at, but also if it is public versus private, and that in public space black people keeps being shot at, then it's not a problem of whether it's on public space or in private space. Like, it's just a massive, bigger problem of policing and regimes of oppression. So I think first we need to address that, and then we can go back to a very romanticized idea of doing like public space like a Renaissance Italian city might have had, or things like that. So I think I think sometimes it's also, because I'm saying that also because I've seen this conversation a lot in New York on privately owned public space. I was part of Occupy Wall Street myself, and that's how we had the legal grounds of being evicted from that space we were on. But again, like, yeah, I think there's a massive prioritization that needs to be done between like white anti-capitalist activists being evicted from the space they're on, or black people being shot at in any sort of public space that they might be on in this country. So, yeah.
One more.
Okay, I was continuously looking at this picture of Algiers and the beautiful tale that I didn't know about what happened here. And I was like obsessed by this image that it's so similar to the narrow streets of the ancient city of Genova. And I was in Genova in 2001, and the results of that fight were quite different. Same brutality, but quite a different outcome. Because in that case, it was impossible to escape anywhere. So the same kind of city with the same sinuous streets, like narrow alleys, and possibility of escape was completely differently occupied by power forces to beat and strike. So could it be that in reality, the same architecture is producing two very different outcomes? So my point is, could it be that it's how our bodies decide to occupy the space, to move across the space, to use that space that change the outcome of a space which is in reality the same kind of space? So could it be that it's on us and not on truly how the space is physically made?
People leaving the door unlocked.
Yeah, yeah. In Genova, they don't leave the door unlocked because thanks to the gentrification of the city center, it's basically a B&B. So,
but I have an answer to that. But by the way, I as horrifying as it may seem, I think many students are born in 2001. So maybe you might want to tell them about the summit and what happened.
sure. 2001, there was this big summit of the 8 most politically and economically, let's say, relevant countries, G8 it's called, and particularly in that moment there was a big, let's say, protest movement starting around themes as ecology, equality, let's say political powers, protesting the way, let's say, economic politics and climate change were handled at that moment. And this big protest movement gathered in Genova to protest against the G8 politics. And for 4 days, it was like a civil war, and people not only get, let's say, bite in the streets by police and army, but they were also, let's say, took from their sleep and incarcerated with no reason. Like 15 years after that, an international court decided that it was in fact torture, but it took us 15 years to get there. So.
And one protester was killed.
Yeah. Carlo Giuliani.
Pablo Giuliano? Carlo Giuliano. I didn't know his name. Yeah, so last example, maybe talking about something like, I mean, you know, I did the corridor, I did the wall, I did the door, the key. I could maybe do the bridge to finish, which is really another kind of corridor. But you know, the bridge is like, there's always like this slightly cheesy slogan that says like, build bridges, not walls. And sure, it's nice. I mean, you know, it comes from the right spirit, let's say. But what, you know, today is October 19th. 2 days ago was October 17th. Good logic, right? And October 17th is actually a date very important for people for whom anti-colonial struggle is important in France, because it is, and of course in Algeria, because it was 2 days ago the 61st anniversary of a massacre of over 200 Algerian people in the very streets of Paris towards the end of the Algerian Revolution by the Parisian police in front of Parisians, white Parisians. And the main space that is sort of recognized as being the site of the massacre is a bridge. If you ever go to Paris, to put it simply, it's kind of almost the bridge that is in front of Notre Dame Church. And a bridge hits me as being a space that can be incredibly easily controlled, because it's narrow, so it's like a corridor, it's narrow. And if you were to have a massive demonstrations like the Algerians were having it that night, it would be quite easy for the police, and as they did, to be able to control them, and in that case to shoot at them and arrest them, beat them up. I talk about Occupy Wall Street. I mean, how easy was it to arrest 300 people on the very first few days of the movement on the Brooklyn Bridge, because there's literally nowhere to go. Yet there are examples in which a bridge is being taken by activists, perhaps during strikes or massive movement in general, and then all of a sudden, the bridge becomes an easier architectural typology to defend, because for the exact same reason that the police was able to control it. And so, in that case, it hits me as being a space that is not neutral in any possible way, because again, it encourages control, but then what kind of control is being exercised on it is, of course, only dependent on us, and architecture will never be unfiable. Is that a word? Like, no, thanks. Is that a word? Nope. There's always ways to sort of go around it, or to like scratch with a spoon or things like that. And then also because colonialism also is a system that sometimes we make it like this almighty power, when actually quite often they do this kind of shit, like where they would put like everyone they're fighting against in the same space and don't realize that it will create organization from within. So I think the fact that colonialism can be so dumb sometimes is kind of a motive for hope. So maybe I'll leave it on that.
Thank you very much, Léopold. Thank you for the students for coming and staying. Hope you got